Test, test.
Sounds pretty good.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Please find a seat. We're glad you're here. How's everybody doing this morning? Thumbs up? All right. Our guest today is Dr. Mark Douglas from Columbia Theological Seminary. He's back for a second week to speak to us about food, farms, and faith. This is the sixth installment of our class and the final installment for now. We hope you all have enjoyed it. If you've missed a few, they're available on the Trinity YouTube channel, so you can check them out. Not next week, but the following week, we have Sarah Bogue from Candler coming to speak to us about queens, saints, and visionaries. So be sure to be here for that. It'll be here in Williams Hall. And before I turn it over to Mark, I'd like to offer a brief word of prayer. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We pray today for everyone who suffers from food insecurity, homelessness, violence, and oppression. We ask that you help us to be your hands and feet in the world, to serve them and to serve others. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And now I'll turn it to Mark. If you have a question during the presentation, please raise your hand and Velma will bring you the microphone.
Well, happy Palm Sunday, all. Good to be back with you today. Just a quick recap of where you all have been for the past 6 weeks. So in week 1, John Tyrrell, who's not able to be with us today, spent some time talking about his own story and thinking about regenerative agriculture. In week 2, Dan Latham from First Press Atlanta came and talked about his own work in the restaurant industry and food consumption. In weeks 3 and 4, Sam Adams, professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary Sam's in Richmond, but it's also in Charlotte, talked about scripture and food. Last week, you got me on food and environmental justice, and we're down to week 6, me thinking about food and climate change. A little challenge for you is to think about how those 6 weeks need to recur, not just kind of educationally, but how might the things that you all have been talking about, learning about, shape the way you individually and Trinity Presbyterian Church might engage questions about food, faith, and farms. So that's a little bit about where we were, a little bit more. You'll remember I gave you an awfully long and awkward definition of environmental justice and then gave you a much tighter definition, slightly more flexible definition, my definition, that environmental justice is the pursuit of those conditions which promote the flourishing of all creatures in any given ecosystem. I just wanted you to have that in the back of your head, along with this slide, which you may remember, in thinking about food and environmental justice. And I'm not going to work my way through all of those questions again. We did that last week, and we've got stuff to do this week, and I want to save more time than we had last week for question and answer. But in that context, just keep in mind that when you're thinking about food, you're thinking about its creation, you're thinking about variety, you're thinking about distribution, access, quantity, quality, consumption, its waste, and the future of food. Like, these are all kind of points to be thinking about in the food journey, as it will. So while we talked about environmental justice and food work, I want to recognize that there are some limits to what environmental justice has been able to do of late. And there's limits of 2 sorts. The first sort of environmental limit is just the history, economics, and political will to do things about it. That picture is the headwaters of the South River on the south side of Atlanta. In case you're curious, that is not the natural color of water. Its headwaters means that just about 150, 200 yards away, it sits at the Eastern Continental Divide, the high point, and decades ago, there was a cotton mill there. And so that cotton mill, in the way that cotton mills of the time did, would kind of dispose of its waste by just burning and burying it out back. And that waste wasn't only leftover cotton, it was also then any number of hazardous materials that got buried. And these are, we're talking decades ago, half century ago, a century ago that this is at work. And although this is the headwaters, so we're close to the top, it's still the case that in that couple hundred yards, as water kind of comes up out of the earth and moves around and comes to the headwaters, it goes through all that polluted stuff. The suspicion is that that water is polluted, that water is that color because of the cotton fibers. It shapes kind of, as it carries these micro cotton fibers down, it shapes how the light is reflected. But the water's pollution isn't just about the cotton fibers, it's also about any number of hazardous materials that are in there. And this particular site, there's been a set of legal battles that have been going on for over 30 years about how to clean it up. Because the people that own the property that is contaminated weren't the people that owned the mill. And so they don't want to clean it up because it's going to be really, really expensive to do so. Because you have to be very, very careful when you're pulling all this stuff up out of the earth that you're not just spreading it around and making things worse. And it's difficult then to figure out, like, okay, who's going to clean it up? How's it going to get paid for along the way? There's just been a new grant that a nonprofit that works with the South River got for quite a bit of money. And part of what they're going to do is actually bring in like some bike paths and walking paths to the area, because this is just, maybe a mile from downtown Hapeville, with the idea being that if we actually make more people see this, there may be more political will to do something about it, because right now it's in an economically depressed area, Martell Homes, that doesn't get a lot of concern. So this large question about kind of history, economics, and political will is something that environmental justice folks work on all the time. The other big issue is just to recognize this kind of catastrophic environmental degradation that we're living in right now. I don't know if you all read the New York Times. There was an editorial this last week suggesting that we live in what the writer called the obscene age. An age where we can see, visually experience in our own lives the costs, the environmental costs of the changes that we have wrought over time. And so on the one side, you have kind of the complexity of dealing with things that are often generations old. And on the other side, you have the complexity of dealing with things that have been ongoing for centuries even, and are going to have an impact for generations going forward. So what are we going to do with foodstuffs, with food and farms, when systems around us are changing? Well, one thing we might do is think about food concerns of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a big fancy term for a geological age that some folks at least suggest are the age we're moving into. And geological ages, right, are not like 100 or 150 or a couple hundred, even 1,000 years. We're talking 10,000, 15, 20,000 year ranges. And the Anthropocene is a handy term that got popularized by a chemist named Paul Kreutzer to say, we're now at an age where imagine an alien species 500,000 years from now comes to the Earth and they start digging through, as anthropologists do. They're going to hit a level, a strata, and they're going to say, this strata is different than the one that came before. It's going to have things on it that didn't exist below that. And the strata that's here is all the things that are different are things that human beings did. Right? We are now have the capacity to change the Earth's geological history at long-term levels. And that's kind of what Anthropocene means, that anthropos, human beings, right? We are now kind of the center of all this stuff. So some food concerns with the Anthropocene. We are, as Elizabeth Colbert writes, in the middle of the 6th great extinction in the history of the Earth. That we are at somewhere, and it's hard to tell because we're still discovering species, somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the natural background rate of extinction of species, which means a huge loss of biodiversity. And when you lose biodiversity, you're going to end up with fewer plants and animals and microorganisms that are necessary for pollination, for cleaning water, for controlling pests, for keeping soil fertile, and for negotiating food waste, right? The less types of species we have around has consequence for our food and its ability, and our ability to kind of grow nourishing food for the world. Increased pollution around the world leads to stunted plant growth, smaller crops, poorer nutrition, and widespread health issues across species. I heard a public health scientist say that somewhere around 10% of deaths worldwide are attributable to air pollution at this point. Not like the only cause, but an exacerbating cause that leads to death. And global warming. Global warming is leading to desertification, ocean acidification, flooding, drought, increased movement of invasive species, and greater risk of widespread fires. Sometimes we see those fires, right? We may remember several years ago big fires across much of Australia in kind of their growth areas, right? So this life in the Anthropocene is complicated, and it complicates our ability to raise crops and grow animals, grow plants and raise animals. Getting lost in my verbs there. And I want to recognize that these are direct effects, right? What I haven't named in the middle of this is the impact, the social, the economic, the political impacts of things like loss of biodiversity, increased pollution rates, and global warming. So I know I kind of bummed people out last week, and I warned you, it doesn't get better right now. We are facing more serious issues with regard to food than we ever have before. Into the middle of that then, one way that we have been thinking, those of us who work in environmental justice projects think, is to start to think about climate justice. And climate justice, here's a definition kind of that I've cobbled together. A form of environmental justice that attends to the inequitably distributed causes, benefits, and effects of climate change on populations. And they're not just human populations, species populations. Part of what we recognize increasingly as we move further into the Anthropocene is that human beings, almost Homo sapiens, are part of networks of systems, and our well-being, our flourishing turns on the flourishing of others, species, other systems. So the effects of climate change on populations and seeks to repair, prevent, and or mitigate such effects. Let me pause there for a moment, and Velma's here with the mic, so if there are any questions or comments at this point before we take a step forward and think about, well, how do we think about food stuff and what we need to be thinking about in that kind of long list of creation, distribution, access, consumption, all that stuff. Any questions?
Judy,
comments?
did you bring Kleenex this time? Good. Yeah.
In connection with environmental justice, could you give us an example of that?
Of environmental justice or,
Yes.
or climate justice?
Climate justice, excuse me.
Climate justice.
Well, a climate
Right.
environmental justice up there.
Yeah. Here's a place that climate justice folks are working. There are as you know, there are any number of low-lying island nations, most famous being like Kiribati and Tuvalu, that are likely to be underwater because of rising sea levels within the next generation. And so they are asking, what is an appropriate international response to the fact that our land, all of our space, our country is going to be underwater? We're going to have to move. Where are we going to go? Where will we be welcomed? Where can we claim our own unique national identity when our nation disappears? That's also something we're facing here in the U.S. A couple weeks ago, I was down in Louisiana. There are Native American populations, Native tribal groups there in the Pontchartrain region. that are facing as a result of the building out of any number of canals and dikes, but also rising sea levels and seawater influx. They're facing their own areas disappearing underwater. And so the federal government recently had like a $500 million plan to create new space for them to move. That's Louisiana. We have the same thing on far up north with folks in Alaska, native groups who are watching the melting of permafrost lead to, and erosion lead to their homes, their areas kind of disappearing into the sea. So what are we doing with those groups? That's a kind of a climate justice issue.
I just want to throw in a little beyond, everybody thinks about sea level rise, which is the sort of things you're talking about, but it also can happens locally where you've got, poorer people have historically lived down in lower lying areas along streams up in northwest Atlanta, Proctor Creek and all that. And, one of the climate change impacts here is heavier, more intense rains, and then they're getting washed out. And then think about the farmers in the Midwest and you talked about desertification as soil gets hotter, harder to grow. So
Yeah.
I think it's important for people to understand it's not just the sea level rise.
Exactly. It is not. It's local. It's all of those kind of factors, because you get drought and flooding, or you get changed weather systems. So you're having kind of weather come in at the wrong time for growing periods. And it's all over the place. Anything else? Let's move forward. I promise there's actually going to be a little bit of good news toward the end. I promise. All right, so here's our old slide on food and environmental justice. You've seen this before. Let's empty that out and shift to climate justice and ask the question, what are some of the questions of climate justice with regard to these things? So with creation of food, what has happened to the land and foodstuffs over time as they've been modified? And how sustainable are these modifications? Right, and here modifications occur. We've been modifying foodstuffs as long as basically we've been upright, but we've gotten much more technologically sophisticated at how to do it. That said, we've also figured out where the money is on foodstuffs, and so the money goes towards some crops much more than others because of the ease with which you can grow some things against others and the volume of what you can grow and what's popular. Recognizing that popularity is subjective and driven partly by our own willingness to receive advertising about what kind of stuff to eat. Variety. What do we need to do to promote biodiversity for the sake of long-term survival of other species and us? Last week I talked a little bit about kind of catastrophic hive collapse among bees when bees are a necessary and important feature of pollination for not only kind of the flowers that we like in our yard, and God bless the flowers that are blooming right now. This is my favorite season in the year in Atlanta, when both the azaleas and the dogwoods are blooming. Like, you don't get better than this right now. But also for farms, which need pollinators for food to grow. Distribution, how do we ensure that vulnerable populations have access to food that meets their basic needs? Access, what policy changes are necessary to shape regional, national, and international access to healthy foods? One of the big claims for those who work in environmental and climate justice is that individual action is laudatory, but to negotiate the types of issues that we're facing in their size, it's not enough for kind of individuals to do good stuff. Instead, individuals have to come together as collectives in political systems to bring about policy change. Quantity. How can we grow food more efficiently in the face of drought, of flooding, and changing ecosystems without also exacerbating the long-term harms that some efficiencies can produce? Part of what I want to get you to hear in the middle of this is that there is no forward step that doesn't include some backward stepping. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Quality. What diverse types of foods ought we be producing? There's a lot of really interesting food out there that never shows up in Publix. because it's not part of our system of how we eat. But it can be. Go to, the New DeKalb Farmers Market or some of the other big places and oh my gosh, there's types of food I didn't know existed here. What do you do with this? Consumption. What sorts of diets ought we be moving towards? Since I talked a lot last week about meat, and I told you I'm a meat eater, and I will note that it takes about 10 times as much energy to produce a pound of beef in terms of its caloric value as it does to produce the same caloric value for vegetables. That is, it just takes a lot more energy. We spend a lot more energy to produce meat compared to vegetables, compared to fruits. Waste. How do we build out policies and habits that reduce/reuse/compost waste, right? How can we move things away from creating problems and toward creating benefits? Because compost is actually a pretty good thing. It's necessary, it's useful, but it's not useful when it's in a landfill. Landfill, if it shows up there, just creates methane. Methane's a problem, compost is a good thing. So how do we move waste? In the future, how do we weigh the good of future generations in comparison to present ones? How do we attend to what type of world are we creating for our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren along the way? So these are some of the questions that climate justice folks might ask. Toward asking them, I want to kind of promote 3 big ideas for the church. The first idea is that we need to learn from complicity. I'm going to get kind of nerdy here for a minute, and I'm going to suggest to you that the history of modern ethics, which, since I'm an ethicist, is what I'm supposed to know about, has been premised on the idea that the way to engage moral issues is to do 2 things. One is to evade or avoid complicity, that is, don't do things that get you caught up in systems that cause harm, or to undo complicity. To recognize that I'm a part of this, but now I'm going to undo it, I'm going to fix it. And what I want to suggest to you that is in the Anthropocene, we need to give up both of those ideas as unhelpful. We cannot, in this age, live without being complicit in things that cause harm. We are going to use electricity. We are going to eat food. These are just kind of part of what we do. And when we do that, we need to recognize we are participating in larger systems of consumption, of all kinds of things that exacerbate problems. However, instead of trying to get away from it or to evade it or deny it, what we might do is start to think about how to learn from our complicity, how we might recognize that because we are complicit, we are also connected. And because we are connected, we start to recognize that things we do here have an impact on people over there, on species over there, and think about, okay, how does my connection to these things reshape how I'm going to think about how I deal myself in my own life, or how we as a community deal with things that are outside of our own particular lives, right? Building out webs of relationship is one of the great byproducts of learning to live with complicity. The more we recognize our relatedness to things, the more we can recognize that our flourishing depends on their flourishing and work toward that. So the first thing I want to suggest is that we need to learn from our complicity rather than denying it, rather than evading it, or rather trying simply to undo it. Paradoxically, I want to suggest the second big thing is that part of what we do in the middle of that, in this learning from complicity, is to pursue what our Jewish friends call tikkun olam, the repair of the world. And what I mean by this is as we think about what justice looks like, instead of thinking about justice primarily in distributive ways, how much does this person get versus that person? Instead, we ought to be thinking about justice in reparative ways. How much does this action contribute to repair of harms done, rather than just kind of the distribution of harm? So as we pursue tikkun olam, as we pursue repair of the world, we might end up with some dramatically different ways of thinking about how to engage on economic, political, social issues. And then the third big idea for the church especially is to see our food in the world, to learn to see our food in the world Eucharistically. We know, as an act of faith or as a matter of faith, that somehow that when we participate in the Eucharist, in the bread and the wine, we are doing multiple things at once. The first is to note that we are connected with other Christians throughout time and space, right? That union with includes people who have come before, people who will come after, and people who are around us now. Second thing we note when we participate in it is that we are actually engaged with real material stuff, basic stuff necessary for our well-being, food, drink. Right? We set that at the center of our Eucharistic practices. The third thing we note is that this food and drink isn't something that we understand as kind of stuff we earned, but as gifts that we are receiving. That is, we start to live into a vision of gratitude rather than ownership. And the fourth thing we learn, and this is probably the most mystical of it, is that somehow in this bread and wine, they themselves are charged with Christ's presence. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. Somehow, God's own being and sense of how to act in the world are connected to this stuff. Which suggests that as we start to think about kind of our own food practices, to the degree that we do recognize that food is a good, material stuff is good, that we ought to savor rather than just kind of snarf it down. That's a good thing. To the degree that we recognize that when we're eating, we are connected with others outside of ourselves, outside of our immediate community. That's a good. When we recognize that God is the giver of all good gifts, and so that what we're receiving is kind of something that isn't just about what we're entitled to, but something that has come from beyond levels of entitlement for us. That's a good. And we start to recognize that somehow God is at work in us, in food, and in food systems. That's a good. Because part of what that does will shift us from thinking about what should we do out there to thinking about what do we see God doing out there. As we see what God's doing out there, then maybe we can figure out how to get on board with it and work with God along the way. So this is the good news, that these things, this recognition that instead of trying to evade, avoid, or undo complicity, we can learn from it. This idea that we ought to be working about pursuing reparative justice, and this idea that we can see food and our foodstuffs and our engagements with food systems Eucharistically, those are all deeply a part of the Christian tradition, especially the Reformed tradition. The Reformed tradition, we're heavy on, you're caught up in complicity, right? We're one of those branches of the global church, of God's church, that actually is big on a prayer of confession happening somewhere that recognizes, yeah, that we're part of the system. Our sin is a part of what we're negotiating right now. We haven't escaped it. We're also part of a system that recognizes that when we're acting as church, we're acting toward repair because God is bringing about transformation. God is bringing about repair. And we're part of a system that recognizes that one of the most meaningful places that gets expressed is how we deal with food around others, right? That's good news. Because what it means is there are actually resources in place for us to be thinking about food issues, for food, faith, and farms in the midst of environmental injustice and the need for climate justice that are already there if we're just going to pay attention to them. And we're paying attention to them. The Presbyterian Church USA, our denomination, is full of thinking about this and resources for it. So, for instance, we have a new social creed that was created about a decade ago, which probably none of you knew happened, but it was 100 years after a big social creed was created that a lot of mainline churches across the U.S. Bought into. And the social creed includes a section on thinking about hunger and food. There is, for instance, a number of projects related to kind of producing global hope. How are we connected to others around the world, and how does that manifest in our very concrete material practices and food related to food stuff? We have particular study papers that have been given. We Are What We Eat was passed by the General Assembly, I want to say 15, 20 years ago. Don't quote me on that. In thinking about how we as Presbyterians relate to food systems. The Church Responding to Rural America was passed slightly before that by the General Assembly, thinking about how do we engage farms and farmers in a time of significant change in rural America. Right? So we're creating documents and study guides along the way. But we're not just kind of creating documents, although that's kind of something that we do pretty well, We write a lot. But we're also engaged in a wide range of activities. So the Compassion, Peace, and Justice arm of the denomination through the Presbyterian Mission Agency is active all over the United States in supporting various programs, some of which kind of boil down to local churches, some of which look like having an advocacy body in Washington, D.C., the Office of Public Witness, which takes decisions made by the General Assembly, which is us, and says, well, we will go do advocacy for this on Capitol Hill. And among the things we are always advocating for are environmental justice and food security. Right? Every time there's a bill that relates to those, then Jimmy Hawkins at the Office of Public Witness, or one of the associates there, goes and has conversations with our legislators and says, I come on behalf of the Presbyterian Church USA, which has made this statement on food or on health. And we want you to know where this denomination stands, and we would like you to support this bill. So we have Compassion, Peace, and Justice. We have Presbyterian Disaster Assistance, which works both nationally and internationally where there have been catastrophes. One of the most efficient organizations we have in the denomination goes out and works in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe and long-term aftermath of catastrophe, including on those issues related to the causes that inhibit kind of food production, food use, right? Where there's hurricanes, where there's fires, Presbyterian Disaster Assistance is there doing work. We have the Presbyterian Committee on the Self-Development of People, which was born of a particular reparative project that came out of the late 60s in the old Northern Presbyterian Church and has been accepted by kind of the whole of PCUSA since then, that says the best way that Presbyterians, or one of the best ways that Presbyterians can help bring about justice, pursue repair, is to work with local communities around the world, including in the US, that are building up their own capacity to thrive in the midst of hardship. And so micro grants to small farming communities in Central America, for instance, is something that SDOP does. And the director of SDOP actually lives part of the year here in Atlanta because Alonzo Johnson is the spouse of our EP, our Presbyterian exec, Aisha Brooks Johnson. So if you want to talk about SDOP, you got the guy who leads it for the denomination who lives in town here half the year when he's not up in Louisville. Bring him in. He can talk about the amazing stuff that SDOP does. You have the Presbyterian Health, Education, and Welfare Association, which is kind of an overseeing body of about a dozen different organizations that work with those three issues, health, education, and welfare, at kind of regional and national levels. So when the Presbyterian Church is thinking about mental health, when the Presbyterian Church is thinking about food stuff, PHEW, PHEWA is at work. And you have the Presbyterian Hunger Program, which does amazing work around the US with bodies to help pursue creating systems of kind of sustainable foodstuffs for communities around the US, right? We're not alone. We have all of this resource. We have these people who are doing this amazing work with and on our behalf that we're supporting through our giving. And when we do so, we recognize that they're not doing it because they think they're going to solve all the problems of the world. They do it because they look out and they see God involved in local communities. They see God calling us to be at work on particular issues. They see God inviting us to participate in God's work toward the restoration of creation, toward its transformation into what God has not yet brought about, but what God has promised to and is actively doing now. Next Sunday, on Easter, we're going to be celebrating the resurrection as a sign of God's commitment toward all of that. A promise that this is something that we are going to be at work on, and that because of what God does on Easter in Jesus Christ, we don't have to fix everything. God can do that. It's not our job to solve the world. It's our job to figure out what God is doing to bring about transformation and then get on board with it. That's the invitation. All right. I said more time for questions.
Awesome sermon.
Thank you.
Great.
So let's get to, and that doesn't even count all the PCUSA related programs, right? Living Waters for the World, which works on water issues around the world and is based in Tennessee, was started by Presbyterians. Trick or Treat for UNICEF, which works on getting food to kids, was started by a Presbyterian minister. Like, we show up. Let's do it. All right, I told you it's time for questions, and now we have time for question and answer. Like, this is the last slide. It's just us talking now.
Hi, I travel every week to either Europe or Asia, and it's remarkable, especially certain countries, how they have a grasp on all of this, and the packaging is just so minimal. The portions are so minimal, and the quality of the food is so exceptional. Why is that? And I know it's rhetorical, but why is that such a problem in the U.S., especially packaging? I trust that it's all the competitive brands trying to outdo each other, with their packaging, but it's just everything's so simplified in Europe and Asia. And I'm just curious, is it all political? Is it?
It's a whole syndrome of things, right? So it is political, it's economic, it is legal, it is social. I mean, you've got media saying buy this and not that in a way that doesn't show up in other parts of the world nearly as much. Just as a small example, it's also kind of peculiarly litigious qualities in the way we think about things. Like the need to keep things safe here looks different than it does in other parts of the world, which doesn't mean things aren't safe there. It means that the fear that one person somewhere may have something happen to them doesn't drive policies that turn out to be problematic. What's the lawyer's dictum? Bad cases make for bad laws. Yeah, we're full of bad laws driven by bad cases. So there's any range of things that are associated with this. There's a whole syndrome of stuff. Yeah, Dan.
Well,
yeah.
either way. You just keyed in on it to make a lot of the policy that's made in the United States is to keep us safe, right, and to protect us, which it might be in the early stages true, but also nefarious activities always kind of slide into that.
Yeah.
I got 2 points to this. Going back to a policy portion of this, weather modification. What does your team think about that, and where's your stance on this in the sense of the active weather modification issues that we're dealing with across the globe?
Yeah, so I'm only going to speak for myself and nobody else on this. I think that on the one hand, we need to learn to be kind of experimental in the face of a crisis that all hands on deck trying to figure out what'll work. On the other hand, we need to be suspicious of the idea that we can technologize our way out of our crisis, because technology is part of what drove the creation of the crisis in the first place. And the third is that we need to, I think, abide by, and this may kind of feel like in tension with the first point, which it is because I live in a whole bunch of tensions, we need to abide by something like the precautionary principle, which the denomination has signed on to valuable. The precautionary principle's idea basically is we need to have a pretty good idea of the impact of something before we want to pursue creating it at especially large levels, because if we don't know impact, if we don't have a very good, clear impact, understanding of impact, we can do a lot of harm. Often, usually, unintentionally. But once the harm exists, it's hard to undo. So precautionary principle is a driver for us to think about kind of how to move forward on stuff like geoengineering and weather modification.
I have two questions. If you had complete power locally here, what would you issue as decrees of how we solve the real immediate neighborhood problems that we have here that are showing up all the time, we just don't see them, of people without food? Now, the second question is what?
Because that one's not big enough.
That's right. That's right. The second question is, what is the favorite way you have to prepare steak?
Okay. To prepare steak. All right. The second one's a little bit easier than the first one. So the second one, I still prefer a grill. Charcoal versus propane, I don't care that much. I still prefer it to, the increasingly favored way inside in a pan with, butter and stuff on top of it. I still like, just let me taste the meat instead of all the other stuff that we've put on it. I'll put the rub, if I have a rub on it, it's usually very simple. It would be a little bit of salt and pepper, or some of you may know the restaurant Agave in Cabbagetown area. They sell a rub that I really like because it's got kind of a Southwest thing, and I'm a Colorado boy, I'm a Southwesterner, so I kind of like that rub on occasion. That's the easy one. All right, if I had infinite power to bring about change, what would I do? I would use my infinite power to redistribute power so that power wasn't inequitably set up in systems such that people with more power can pursue their own agendas. I think where it's the case that you find vigorous, rigorous, engaged constituencies that are not hampered by systems that distort what they do or inhibit what they do, by and large, you find better systems. I am a huge fan of the American democratic project as maybe not the ideal way, but it's the best way we've ever found historically to pursue bringing about change for the welfare of others and ourselves. So that's my answer to the power thing, is where you empower people to work with each other, they by and large come up with better systems than where you structure hierarchies of power to bring about change. Which is why I say the most important thing you can do with regard to foodstuffs is figure out how to vote. Because that's kind of the clearest place where we're all doing the same thing, nominally, right? Yeah.
That leads to my question. I mean, not about the politics, but some of my big takeaways of this whole presentation, and Trinity and PCUSA, everything, is we have got to stop being so individualistic that we don't realize, one, we are only here for a short time. We got to think about the future. And two, we've got to think about other people who, and we talk about this a lot, other people, what is the impact on other people? I think this sort of self-centeredness that's sort of cultural in America is a problem. So my question to you is sort of, given all your beliefs and the things you've said, how do you and we communicate that better? I love your slides.
I think the moral center of Christian life looks something like love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Amen. Not less than yourself, but as yourself, which doesn't mean you don't love yourself. It means figure out how to love your neighbors better. And when the lawyer asked Jesus how to do that, what Jesus gave was an example of how to be loving, how to be neighborly. So I think you do those two things, and what is it, St. Francis has said, preach the gospel everywhere, and when necessary, use words. So show that we're doing those two things.
Right. But so I think that's my center. But how do you show how to apply that? I mean, that's...
Yeah.
Well, I'm talking about in specific ways, how do we do those things as in action, behavior, attitude, all those things?
So I teach an entire semester-long class called Love and Justice. And in that semester-long class, we start with the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I spend half the semester just complicating that particular text. I note kind of like, this works in the abstract and it was only supposed to be a parable, but what happens if, for instance, the Samaritan that comes along and sees the guy lying in the ditch has been mugged before for helping? Does that change things? What happens if the Samaritan picks up the guy, puts him on his donkey, takes him toward the inn, and along the way encounters a second guy in the ditch, right? I keep complicating with the purpose of like, okay, as complexity builds, because we live in a complex system, then how do we engage it? B has to also be more complex. So my answer to your question at this point is you have to take my semester-long class to even begin. I can't do in 3 minutes what it takes me, 15 weeks to start at doing.
Is any of this on YouTube?
Can we audit it?
Yeah, yes, you can audit the class. No, it's not on YouTube. That's interesting questions about kind of proprietary stuff there. I'll think about something like that. What we can do more immediately is, as I shared last week and as I'll share this week, is just be alert, be aware, start to recognize that that we are connected to others, that we are connected to other species. My new thing on the Good Samaritan is that the Good Samaritan is the one who gives of themselves to help out. And in the Samaritan story, we have any number of non-humans who helped out. There's a donkey carrying things. There's bees that provided honey for the salve. There is plants that provided cotton for the bandaging. Like, the natural world is being Good Samaritan to us all the time. That's neighborliness. Maybe we should be neighbors to the good